The morning air hung heavy with the kind of stillness that always comes before the sound of drums and folded flags. The kind of silence that made people straighten their backs without even realizing it. The crowd at the gate was thick with uniforms. Metals glinting under the gray sun, their boots scuffing the polished stone like a steady whisper among ghosts. The old man moved slowly, his steps uncertain but his eyes sharp as ever, even if they were half hidden beneath the brim of a weathered cap. The security guard who blocked his way could not have been more than 30, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the identification badge that hung around the stranger's neck. He had seen fakes before, and he was certain this was another one. The name on the tag had been typed on a machine that looked older than his father, and the lamination was cracked at the corners. The old man's hands shook slightly as he held it out again, explaining softly that he had served with General Mason, that he had fought beside him once in a place no one liked to talk about, but the guard cut him off, his tone polite but firm. "Sir, this event is for invited personnel. Only if your name isn't on the list. You'll need to step aside, the veterans." Shoulders tightened, and he looked past the guard to where the honor guard stood ready. Their rifles glinting in formation behind them, the casket waited draped in the flag. The same flag he had carried on his back through rain and smoke and fire. He had come so far to stand here to say goodbye, but now the line between him and that memory seemed as wide as the world itself. He turned the badge over in his hand. The corners soft from years in his wallet. He remembered the sound of Mason's voice on the radio, the crackle, the command, the impossible order that saved a dozen men at the cost of another dozen. He remembered the call sign, the one that no one had spoken since that day, and he wondered if maybe that was the only thing that still mattered. Now the crowd behind him shifted impatiently, people whispering about the delay, a camera crew moving closer to film the entry line. But the guards stayed firm, the older one calling for his supervisor, a tall woman with a silver bar. On her collar, she approached briskly, scanning the veteran from head to toe before speaking. "Sir, you need to leave the area immediately." The old man's gaze did not move from the casket. His throat worked once before he said quietly that he had come to pay his respects, that Mason would have wanted him there. But she shook her head. Rules were rules, and the security perimeter had been cleared days ago. There was no room for strangers at a funeral of this rank. The veteran lowered his head, the brim of his cap hiding his eyes. He took a slow breath, the kind that carries both sorrow and something like resolve. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The tremor in his voice was gone, and when he spoke, the two words hung in the air like a flare fired into the sky. "Mamba 5, at first." No one moved. The words seemed meaningless to the younger soldiers who looked around uncertainly. The female officer frowned, ready to repeat her command, but then something shifted. A man near the front of the crowd, an older officer with ribbons across his chest, turned sharply, his mouth opening in disbelief, his eyes finding the veteran's face, and in that instant recognition struck like thunder. The guard stepped back confused as whispers began to ripple through the line. Mamba 5, the name moved from one pair of lips to another, like a code, like a secret that had been sleeping for years and now refused to stay buried. The older officer pushed through the line, his steps uneven, but determined, his face pale with the weight of memory. He stopped in front of the veteran, staring for a long moment before speaking in a voice that cracked around the edges. "My God, is it really you?" The old man nodded slowly. The officer reached for him, gripping, his shoulder hard as though afraid the man might vanish if he let go. The female officer hesitated, her command forgotten, as the others began to murmur stories of something whispered in training manuals of a rescue that had never been officially acknowledged, a mission that no one had ever claimed because it had been buried under layers of classified silence. The veteran's eyes clouded as he looked beyond them to the casket. He remembered the jungle, the sound of gunfire, the flash of explosions. In the rain, he remembered Mason shouting over the radio, "Hold your ground, Mamba 5! Hold your ground!" And he remembered holding it even when the others fell. He remembered carrying Mason out half-conscious, his arm torn, his voice hoarse with orders. That would haunt him for decades. He remembered the promise they had made that if one of them ever went first, the other would come no matter how long it took, and so he had come just as he said he would, even if no one believed him anymore. Now the guards shifted uneasily, their rigid sense of order dissolving in the face of something deeper, something that could not be written on a guest list. The crowd behind them had gone quiet. All eyes on the old man and the officer who still stood frozen. Before him, the officer turned to the guards and said in a voice that brooked no argument, "Let him through," and the barrier lifted though no one had given the order. The veteran stepped forward. His movements slow, deliberate, each one heavy with the weight of years and memory. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as he passed through the gate, his boots scuffing the stone, the murmur of the crowd following him like a prayer. As he walked, the soldiers lined along the path straightened instinctively, though many of them did not yet understand why something in the air told them this man carried a story that mattered, a story written not in medals or ranks, but in the quiet endurance of someone who had done what others could not. He reached the steps of the hall, pausing beneath the marble archway, the casket waiting inside the band beginning to play a solemn march. His eyes lifted to the flag that covered the box, and for a moment he saw not the symbol of a nation, but the face of a friend, a commander, a brother. The officers inside turned as the sound of his steps echoed through the hall. One of them whispered the words again under his breath, "Mamba 5," and the effect was electric. Men and women who had stood in silence for half an hour suddenly looked alive, their eyes bright with the shock of recognition. Even the general's family turned, curiosity mixing with confusion. The old man stopped before the casket, lowering his cap to his chest, his breath shallow and trembling. The guards who had tried to stop him stood at the entrance, now heads bowed, unwilling to meet his eyes. The female officer's hands clenched around her clipboard, her expression softening as the realization struck that she had nearly turned away, someone who had once carried the general himself to safety. The band's notes faded into stillness, and for a heartbeat the entire hall seemed to listen, not to the music, not to the speeches, but to the unspoken history that hung between the living and the dead. The old man whispered something under his breath, words that no one could quite hear, then straightened, shoulders back and eyes dry. He looked around at the faces watching him, strangers yet bound to him by the same uniform, by the same oath, and for the first time in years, he felt the strange, quiet peace of being seen again. He turned slowly, his gaze drifting back to the guards at the door, and for an instant he gave a small nod, the kind that carried no resentment, only understanding. Then he stepped aside, moving to the edge of the hall as the ceremony resumed. The old officer who had recognized him stood beside him, the two men silent, their eyes fixed on the flag. The drums began again, steady, slow, echoing across the marble and through the crowd, each beat carrying the same unspoken truth that the living remember the fallen, but sometimes the fallen remember the living too. The sound of the bugle lingered like a wound in the air, drawn and fading as the last note trembled. Over the gathered ranks, the old veteran stood motionless before the casket, the hall awash in the echo of silence, his eyes tracing the folds of the flag as though they could reveal the memories stitched into it. The crowd remained still, not out of command, but out of something heavier, something close to awe and fear. The young soldiers who had first questioned him now looked upon him as if seeing a ghost made flesh, their hearts caught between shame and reverence. The female officer who had tried to send him away lowered her gaze, a quiet apology written in the small movement of her hands. Then the colonel who had recognized him cleared his throat, and the sound broke the stillness like glass. He stepped forward, his voice unsteady. As he spoke of the mission, none had dared to name Mamba 5. He said it again, louder this time, and those who had served long enough felt the weight of it in their bones. It was the name whispered only in training rooms and late-night barracks. The name of a rescue buried so deep it had become legend. Soldiers had gone into the jungle. 30 men, only 7 had returned among them. The general himself carried out by the man now standing before them, his name lost in reports, sealed and forgotten. The old veteran did not speak. He merely looked down at his hands, the same hands that once held the life of another man in the dark, his knuckles swollen and scarred the color of old earth. The colonel turned to the crowd, his voice breaking as he told the truth. The general had always said he owed his life to a man with no name, a man who vanished after the war, leaving behind no trace, but a single radio call. Mamba 5 was not just a code, it was a promise, a signal that meant no man left behind. No matter the cost, the old man had carried that promise farther than any of them could imagine. A murmur spread through the hall, the journalists shifting, uncertain, their cameras lowering, for once unsure if they... The sound of the bugle rose again, trembling through the hall, its notes climbing like ghosts toward the vaulted ceiling. Every breath of the crowd seemed caught between silence and memory. The soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, a living wall of respect and disbelief. The story had spread from mouth to mouth like a current running through the ranks. Mamba 5. The name that had lived only in whispers now spoken aloud in the open air where no one could deny it. The old veteran stood near the casket, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the flag as the final notes faded away. The colonel, who had recognized him, stepped forward, his face still pale but his voice steady as he ordered the men to stand at ease. He turned to the veteran and spoke softly, words that the crowd could barely hear. "Sir, we thought you were gone." The old man gave a slow shake of his head, a weary, almost broken smile crossing his face. He said he had been gone in many ways, but not in the one that mattered. He said he had come to keep a promise that had haunted him for 50 years. The colonel nodded, eyes wet, as he remembered the mission that had never made it into any record. Behind them, the family of General Mason looked on the generals. Widow, her hair white and her hands trembling, reached for her son, asking who the man was. The colonel leaned toward her, whispering the name, and she gasped, her eyes widening. She remembered the stories Mason had told late at night after the wars. When he thought no one was listening, he had spoken of a man who had pulled him from a burning convoy, a man he called brother, though no blood bound them. The widow stood slowly, moving toward the veteran, her steps uncertain. The crowd parted to let her through the air thick with reverence. When she reached him, she stopped just before the casket, her eyes searching his face for the young soldier she had only known through her husband's words, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then she said, in a voice barely audible, "Thank you," and the old man bowed his head, his hands trembling. He said, "I just came to say goodbye, Mom." The colonel motioned for the color guard to lower their rifles in salute as the room filled with the sound of boots, striking the floor in perfect rhythm, and for that instant time folded over itself, past and present, blending in a single breath. Outside, the sky had darkened, the rain beginning to fall in slow, steady drops. The people gathered under the awning, watching. Through the open doors as the ceremony continued, the old veteran stood by the casket. His mind a maze of voices and memories. He could still hear Mason shouting over the radio, the sound of rotors in the distance, the static of fear and courage tangled. Together he could see the faces of the men they had lost, faces he had carried with him for a lifetime, and he felt the weight of their silence pressing against his chest. The colonel turned to address the audience, his voice strong but heavy with emotion. He spoke of valor, of service, of brotherhood. He spoke of the missions no one had known, of the debts no medal could ever repay. And when he finished, he turned once more to the veteran and said, "The general once told us that if you ever came back, we were to give you his coin from his pocket, the one he carried on that last mission. and from his coat he withdrew a small weathered coin. Its edges worn smooth by time, he placed it in the veteran's palm. The old man closed his fingers around. It tears sliding down his cheeks, unseen beneath the brim of his cap. A young soldier stepped forward. Then a private barely old enough to remember the last war, he stood stiffly at attention before the veteran and said, "Sir, my grandfather told me about you," he said. "You saved him in the valley, and he said if I ever met you, I should thank you." The old man looked at the boy, his heart catching, as he recognized the name on the badge, the same as one of the men who had fallen that day. He placed a trembling hand on the boy's shoulder and said softly, "Tell your grandfather he was the brave one, not me." The funeral continued with precision, the band playing low and slow, the rifles firing their final salute, the sound echoing off the marble, walls like thunder rolling through a canyon. The crowd flinched at each shot, but the old man did not move, his gaze locked on the flag that draped his friend's coffin, as if he were still standing on the battlefield, still keeping watch over him. The final note of the bugle faded, and a heavy stillness followed, broken only by the sound of the wind pushing through the open doors. Then from the back of the hall a voice spoke, not loud, but firm, the kind of voice that carried without effort. It was another soldier, gray-haired, his face marked by years of command. He said to the crowd, "You all know the name of General Mason, but today you have seen the man who made that name possible. This man here was the reason any of us made it home that day." He turned toward the veteran and saluted, and slowly, one by one, every person in uniform did the same, until the hall was filled with the rustle of sleeves, the steady rhythm of respect. The veteran stood motionless, his breath trembling, his mind caught. Between pride and grief, he had spent decades running from the ghosts of that mission, and now here they were standing beside him unseen, but felt their presence wrapped around him like the smoke of that long-ago fire. He whispered under his breath the names of the men they had lost, each syllable, a quiet offering. The colonel stepped closer, resting a hand on his shoulder, saying softly, "They are all here today, you know." And the old man nodded, not trusting himself to speak. When the service ended, the crowd began to disperse, but few could bring themselves to leave right away. The rain outside had thickened into a steady downpour, turning the steps slick and shining. The old veteran remained near the casket, the colonel beside him as soldiers, and civilians alike came to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him they had heard stories of him, though they had never believed them. Until now, he listened to them all quietly, his responses short, his mind still elsewhere. Finally, the colonel said, "Come with me. There is something you should see." They walked together down a long corridor lined with portraits of generals and commanders. The air cool and echoing, the colonel stopped before a new frame covered by a cloth. He nodded to a young officer, who pulled the cloth away, revealing a black and white photo taken long ago. The edges faded. It showed a group of weary soldiers in the mud of the jungle. One of them, younger but unmistakable, stood at the center. The old veteran gasped quietly, his hand lifting toward the image as if touching the memory itself beneath the photo. A small plaque read, "Operation Mamba 5, and below it the names of those who had served and those who had not returned. The colonel said quietly, "The general had this, placed here in secret. He said someday you might come back. And when you did, he wanted you to know he never forgot." The old man stared at the plaque, his vision blurring. He could hardly believe the general had kept that promise, all those years his. Throat tightened as he whispered, "Thank you, though." Whether to the colonel or to the memory of his friend, he could not say. Later, as the hall emptied and the guards began to close the gates, the rain outside eased into a mist. The veteran stepped out. Into it, the dampness cool against his skin, the air thick with the scent of earth and metal. He stood on the steps looking down at the rows of headstones stretching beyond the horizon, and for the first time in years, the weight in his chest seemed to lift. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the coin the colonel had given him, and held it tight between his fingers. Then he knelt and placed it on the ground before the flag still fluttering weakly in the wind. He whispered into the rain, "You kept your word, old friend, and I kept mine." Then he rose, turning toward the road, his figure small against the endless gray as he began to walk away. No one stopped him. No one asked his name. The guards at the gate saluted silently as he passed there. Faces solemn, the younger of the two, the one who had first turned him away, stood straighter. This time his voice low but full of respect as he said, "Safe travels, sir." The old man nodded once the faintest of smiles crossing his lips before he disappeared. Into the mist long after he was gone, the colonel remained inside the hall, staring at the photo of Mamba 5. He felt a chill pass through him, though the air was still, and he could have sworn for a heartbeat that he heard the distant hum of the old radios, the clipped commands of men who had long since faded into history. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Mamba 5, stand down mission complete." Outside, the rain stopped, and a single beam of sunlight broke through the clouds falling across. The steps where the veteran had stood moments before the coin, glinting faintly in the light like a promise, finally kept a reminder that some names might never appear in records or speeches, but they lived in the silence between notes in the breath. Before the salute in the memories carried by those who survived, and though no one would ever write his story in the books, the men who had been there would never forget the call sign that saved them all, Mamba 5.